It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Dermot Quinn, professor at Seton Hall University, who graduated from Trinity College in Dublin, has his PhD from Oxford University. He's been teaching at Seton Hall University for almost 30 years, and it's a great pleasure to introduce him for his talk today on how the Irish saved Christianity in the Middle Ages. Dr. Quinn.
Well, thank you, Jim, and thanks everybody for coming out today. It's a really great pleasure to be back here at the Old Guard. I've been telling people about this group for years. I mean, thanks to Mort Shea, I was able to come a few years ago, and I said it was one of the most impressive groups I've ever spoken to in my life. I mean, they get together at 10 o'clock in the morning and they sing songs with nothing stronger in their stomachs than regular coffee, I can now report that they get together and tell Viagra jokes, I will tell that joke myself. I've got a couple of Viagra jokes myself, but I think given that I'm going to be talking about Irish monks in the Middle Ages, it wouldn't be entirely appropriate that I tell a few Viagra jokes. But nonetheless, it's absolutely marvelous to be here. I've got a few little images that I want to show. Jim was telling me that you're going to have kind of a marvelous array of speakers this month. Someone will be speaking on Stanley Steamer, and then someone on the Ukraine. And then at the end of the month, you're going to have Congresswoman Cheryl. I can assure you I'm not looking for any votes, but this is my talk might be perhaps the least controversial of all talks, because I'm only going to be talking about Irish monks in the Middle Ages. You know, I wanted to start by just showing you a picture, well, several pictures. The first picture is of this man, Geraldus Cambrensis. And, you know, I'm putting up this picture because he is someone who came to Ireland in 1183. This is a statue of him, which is in St. David's Cathedral in Wales. Geraldus Cambrensis means Gerald of Wales, and he came to Ireland with the Norman invaders of Ireland. He came from Wales. This is actually a picture of where he was born, so you can get a sense this is a castle in northern Wales. You know, he came over with a group of invaders to Ireland in 1183, and basically he came to see what Ireland was like, and basically also to justify this invasion from Wales, or this invasion from England. And you know, if you ever want to know what Ireland was like in the Middle Ages, then this is the man that you should read, because he gives a kind of a wonderful description of what Ireland was like. And basically his view of Ireland was very critical. He thought that the Irish people were lazy. He said that they had little use for money making, and they said that their greatest pleasure is not to work, and the greatest wealth is to enjoy liberty. And when I read that the greatest pleasure is not to work and the greatest wealth is to enjoy liberty, it reminded me of the Summit Old Guard of happy memory and of 100 and many years. And what he said about the Irish, and the point that I would like to make is, and it's a kind of a wonderful phrase, they are rude and religious. And that image, or that phrase, that description of the Irish as rude and religious is something which in a sense hasn't really changed that much. The Irish in some ways, as far as some people are concerned, are kind of rather uncouth and uncultivated, and certainly up until relatively recently they were famed for their religiosity. I suppose what I'm going to try to say this morning is that if you look at the history of Irish Christianity in the Middle Ages, it's a history of certainly religiosity, but it's a history of extraordinary civilization. And as Jim was saying when he was introducing me, what I really want to be kind of concentrating on is the way that, the Irish saved civilization. And in fact, it's the title of a famous book of a few years ago, How the Irish Saved Civilization. It was a huge bestseller by a man called Thomas Cahill, who, by the way, taught at Seton Hall for a few years. So what I'm interested in is how the Irish saved civilization. And if you've ever read that book, I mean, it seems to be in some ways kind of slightly preoccupied with sexual matters. There's a kind of a whole section on that Irish penitential literature, which I hope get a chance to talk about at the end of my little talk. And really, this notion of the Irish as rude and religious, I think, is a bit unfair. They are certainly religious. They are certainly in some ways uncouth. But I think you could also make the case that in a very, very dark age, they were the most civilized people in Europe. Here's a few images from Gerald of Wales's famous topography of Ireland in 1186. It's full of kind of interest for people who are scientific. I mean, he describes the flora and the fauna. He describes kind of the natural topography of Ireland, what it looks like, hills and mountains and so on. But he also describes the religious life of Ireland. And he says that, one of the things about the religious life of Ireland is that it's rather strange. I mean, he found it very difficult to fit the Irish way of being Christian with his experience of being Christian. He said that Irish priests and Irish monks had a kind of a magical quality. And here is an image from that book where you see a monk who's basically having a kind of a conversation with a wolf. And, this idea that the Irish clergy had a kind of wizard, druid-like quality, that they could actually speak to animals. It was something that very much struck him. So the first thing that an outsider saw about Ireland in the 12th century is the strangeness of Ireland, the uncouthness of Ireland, if you like, the exoticism of Ireland. Excuse me. I assure you that I don't have COVID, so don't worry. I'm quite all right. So, to talk a little about Irish Christianity, of course, we have to talk about the man who brought Christianity to Ireland, and that is St. Patrick, or at any rate, the man who is reputed to have brought Christianity to Ireland, because I think, although most people assume that St. Patrick was the first person to come to Ireland to bring the Christian gospel, most historians don't really believe that anymore. St. Patrick wasn't the first man to bring Christianity to Ireland. There are all sorts of scholarly arguments about who the first Christians were in Ireland. There was someone who was in Ireland before St. Patrick, who is known as Palladius, and he's sometimes referred to as St. Pauldy. So I don't think anybody would seriously argue that St. Patrick was the first Christian to come to Ireland. But here he is, pictured in the way that most people imagine him, as a man, as a bishop. And he is, you can see at the bottom of the picture, he is standing over a bunch of snakes, and he's about to expel the snakes from Ireland. That's the kind of image that most people have of St. Patrick. The picture you see on the other side is Pope Celestine, who was the Pope who sent St. Patrick to Ireland in the year 432. Here's another image of that famous commission. This is actually a mosaic. If you were ever to visit Kilkenny, in the southeast of Ireland, this is in the Cathedral of Kilkenny, and there is Pope Celestine with the triple tiara. and St. Patrick accepting this commission to go to the Irish. And when Pope Celestine sent St. Patrick to Ireland, he said, in fact, St. Patrick records the commission in his writings. St. Patrick has left us, two sets of writings, a famous confession, which is a kind of a spiritual autobiography, if you like. And he said, the Pope said that they should be Christian and that they should be Roman. And that's a very interesting phrase, that they should be Christian, obviously, that you should bring the gospel to them, but that they should be Roman. In other words, that they should accept the authority of the Pope. They should be Christian and that they should be Roman. So St. Patrick went to Ireland as a bishop, as someone commissioned by the Bishop of Rome to Christianize the Irish, but also to make them, if you like, Roman Catholics. And that is a very important part of my little story, because in fact, as I will explain in a moment, that lasted for about 100 years, where the Irish were essentially Roman Catholics. They accepted the authority of the Pope, but after about roughly a century after St. Patrick came to Ireland, they were less Roman in their Christianity than they were, if you like, monastic. They tended to be formed into monastic communities. So thank you, Paul. So they didn't so much accept the authority of the Pope. They did accept, in a kind of a nominal way, the authority of the Pope, but they were self-governing. They were organized into monasteries. Well, just to show you a few little pictures to give you the general sense of what Ireland was like during the time of St. Patrick. This is a mountain in the north of Ireland called Slemish, where St. Patrick was captured as a slave. Before he came to Ireland as a priest. He had been in Ireland as a slave, and he tended sheep on this mountain in the northern part of Ireland. He escaped from that. He returned to Britain. And then, as he famously said, I heard the call of the Irish. And he returned. It's kind of a remarkable story, actually. Someone who had been captured, had been kidnapped, and then voluntarily returning to the place where he had been kidnapped, as he said, to bring Christianity to the Irish. He, in the meantime, had been ordained a priest. He studied for the priesthood in France, a place called Auxerre. So St. Patrick is not Irish. I mean, that's kind of the first thing to realize. He was from Roman Britain, and he studied for the priesthood in France. This is a picture of what is known as St. Patrick's Bell, which is a shrine or a reliquary, which is, you could see in the National Museum in Ireland, in Dublin. Very, very beautiful, a very beautiful object. And that contains St. Patrick's bell. Just another couple of little pictures to give you some idea of St. Patrick. On the left-hand side is a map from the 17th century of what is known as St. Patrick's Purgatory. And this is an island in a lake in County Donegal in the northwestern part of Ireland, a place called Lough Derg. Maybe some of you have been, I know some of you have certainly been to Ireland. And if you've been to the northern part, you might have been to Lough Derg. Lough Derg is a place of pilgrimage. And in fact, this is a picture, the photograph is a picture of Lough Derg today. And people go to Lough Derg to engage in penitential practices. Basically, people go and make a 2-day pilgrimage. They'll stay up all night. They'll say prayers. They'll walk around what are known as stations in their bare feet. They'll say the rosary. And the only thing they'll drink is black tea, a bit, once again, like the old guard of Summit, or whatever. And this is a famous place of pilgrimage. And it dates actually from the 5th century and from the time of St. Patrick. St. Patrick is alleged to have made a pilgrimage there during his life and to have seen visions of hell. And some people might think that staying up all night and drinking black tea is itself a vision of hell, but nonetheless, that is St. Patrick's pilgrimage or St. Patrick's Purgatory. One final little picture of the Ireland of St. Patrick. This is a famous place called the Rock of Cashel. If you've been again to Ireland, if you're traveling on the road from Dublin to Cork, you might turn a corner and you'll see this extraordinary medieval castle and monastery on the top of a hill, and that has been a place of Christian worship from the 5th century. And St. Patrick is alleged to have converted the people of Munster, the southern part of the southwestern part of Ireland, from the Rock of Cashel. Anyway, that's just a kind of a very broad picture of St. Patrick. And again, as I said a few minutes ago, St. Patrick was a bishop, and he wanted to make the Irish into Roman Catholics. But by about and he came, as I said, in the year 432. But by about the year 540 or thereabouts, certainly by the year 600, Ireland was really full of monasteries. As you know, I mean, the normal way in which the church is organized is in terms of dioceses. A diocese, a bishop, an archbishop, the Bishop of Rome, and so on. But Ireland took a different turn. Ireland's Christianity was basically monastic Christianity from about the 500s, the mid 500s onwards. And here's just a little map of some of the more prominent Irish monasteries. And one little idea that maybe I should make or suggest is that Ireland is kind of famously divided between the north and the south. I mean, obviously, today you've got Northern Ireland and you've got the Republic of Ireland. And that kind of division between the northern and southern part of Ireland is a very, very long-standing division. It's a political division, but it's also in some ways a kind of a cultural division. And you can see that division going back certainly to the 500s, because you had monasteries in the northern part of Ireland, which basically were founded from Scotland, and then Irish monks returned to Scotland and founded some monasteries of their own. And then you've got monasteries in the southern part of Ireland, and those monasteries were basically founded from Wales, the place where Geraldus Cambrensis came from. So these are some of the kind of the prominent monasteries of Ireland in the early Middle Ages. And what I want to do basically is to show how those monasteries kind of held on to Christianity in the Dark Ages, when the Roman Empire fell, when Europe, was undergoing, the darkest of times, when basically civilization had collapsed in civilization had collapsed in Western Europe, and in Ireland, Christian civilization held on, and then. And this is the basic argument that I want to make. It kind of returned to Europe and came back to a place that was in a state of kind of moral collapse, and having Christianity having, as it were, held on by the skin of its teeth in Ireland, it was able to return to Western Europe thanks to these Irish monks. And just to give you a few images of the people that I'm talking about, one of the most important of these monasteries was a place called Clonmacnoise. But Clonmacnoise is right slap bang in the middle of Ireland on the banks of the River Shannon. And it was one of the great monasteries of the Middle Ages. And it was founded by a man called St. Kieran. And here is a picture, a stained glass picture of St. Kieran. Here's another image of Clonmacnoise from an aerial shot. Here is another picture of Clonmacnoise. This is one of the high crosses of Clonmacnoise. Is called the Scripture Cross. This is actually a reproduction of an older cross. And if you were to come up a bit closer, you could actually see all sorts of engravings and carvings on this cross, and they show scenes from Scripture. Clonmacnoise was, as I've said, a great center of learning, a great center of charity, a great kind of mother house of other monasteries. So men would go to Clonmacnoise, they would be trained in monastic life, and then they would go and set up their own monasteries. Another little picture just to show you some idea of what Ireland was like during this monastic period. And I mean, there are hundreds of Irish monks. Most of them are kind of unheard of, are not well known. Maybe I should put it that way. People who are kind of known very locally. You might be known within a couple of miles of where they happened to be. But one of the very famous monks is St. Kevin. And St. Kevin is associated with a place called Glendalough, which is just south of Dublin, the Glen of the two lakes, it means. And St. Kevin died in the year 618. He's very famous for his kind of austerity, the harshness of his life. He lived apparently until the age of 120, which I think is hard to believe, but nonetheless, he lived to a very old age. And he is famous, again, this is the point that Geraldus Carbrensis was making. He's one of these kind of slightly magical figures who can, kind of talk to animals. So this is a famous picture of St. Kevin talking to a blackbird. And, he was able to hold out his hand. The blackbird was on his hand and completely tamed. And he had this kind of almost magical communication with animals. This is a picture of the Church of St. Kevin. If you've been to Ireland, if you've been to Dublin, it's about a 45-minute drive from Dublin. It's still a very famous place for people to come to visit. This is a map to make the kind of point that I'm kind of interested in pursuing a little of the way in which these Irish monks, having set up their monasteries in the 500s, then went forth. They had this kind of extraordinary desire to wander. There was a great writer of the 9th century called Wilfrid Strabo, and he said that the greatest desire of the Irish is to wander. He said, they simply can't stay still. They have to be on the move. And this old tradition of Irish migration, you can certainly date certainly to the 7th and 8th centuries. And again, what you see, and the map, I know that it's, for those of you in the back, it might be difficult to make out, but you can see that people in the northern part of Ireland went largely to Scotland and to the northern part of England. And then people in the southern part of Ireland tended to go to continental Europe, to France, and as I will show in a moment, probably the most famous of these wandering monks is Saint Brendan, known to history as Saint Brendan the Navigator. And you can see here a picture or a photograph of a statue of St. Brendan in County Kerry. He came from County Kerry in the southwest of Ireland. And St. Brendan, as you can see, died in 577. He was a monk of a place called Clonfert. He set up a monastery in Clonfert. And that's in fact where he died. But he died after a famous life of traveling the high seas, and his voyaging is the subject of one of the most famous books of the Middle Ages, a book called the Voyages of Saint Brendan, the Navigatio Sancti Brendani. And he actually left Ireland from this place, Mount Brandon, in County Kerry. It's a wonderful, beautiful place. And he brought with him a number of followers. He traveled. I mean, this account of his travels throughout the world actually became a kind of a bestseller in the Middle Ages. I mean, it was probably one of the most popular books of the medieval period because it was a kind of it was a mixture of a travel journal, telling kind of these marvelous stories, one of which I'll tell you in a moment. And then it was also a story of, it was a kind of a spiritual diary, how, he encountered the world and what he thought of the world and how he saw the presence of God in the world. So it was a kind of, as it were, a spiritual diary. One of his fellow sailors, there were 12 of them who went off in this little boat, was a man called Saint Malo. And he was the founder of Saint-Malo in France. If you've ever been to Brittany, you might have been to Saint-Malo, so called because it was founded by this follower of St. Brendan. Well, probably the most famous story of St. Brendan is his desire on the high seas to celebrate Easter Sunday Mass. And to do that, they had to find a place where they could set up the altar. They had to find an island. So they found an island, and they set up the altar for the Mass. And then, to their very considerable alarm, the island began to move. And the reason for that is that it wasn't an island at all. It was actually a whale. So the followers kind of jumped off the whale, and St. Brendan apparently knew that it was a whale and said, "Don't worry, it's only a whale. It won't do you any harm." And then he actually reveals the marvelous piece of news that the whale had a name, and the whale's name was Jasconius. How he knew that the whale was called Jasconius, I'm not entirely sure, but he makes a little moral of that. He says, the whole world is God's creation, and God knows his creation by name. So there isn't one part of the world which isn't known to God. So to have a name is really to have an identity. And the whale had an identity. It was called Jasconius. So St. Brendan was able to explain that the reason that the island was moving is that it was a whale, and that the whale had a name. So a kind of a wonderful kind of grab bag of stories, the voyages of St. Brendan. St. Brendan wrote a prayer, which I've just put up on the board or on the screen. It's a lovely little prayer about help me to journey beyond the familiar and into the unknown. Give me the faith to leave old ways and break fresh ground with you. Christ of the mysteries, I trust you to be a stranger than each storm within me. I will trust in the darkness and know that my times even now are in your head. Tune my spirit to the music of heaven and somehow make my obedience count for you. That's a really beautiful prayer, I think. And that is the prayer of this most famous of these wandering Irish monks, St. Brendan. Well, another really remarkable monk is St. Columkill, or sometimes known as St. Columba. And St. Columkill was associated with the town of Derry, or the city of Derry, which is actually where I come from. So I have a kind of a particular affection, I suppose, for St. Columba or St. Columkill. The word Derry means oak grove. Anytime you see the word Derry in an Irish place name like Kildare or whatever, it means an oak grove. So this was the name given to this town by St. Columba. He says, "This is my beloved oak grove," obviously full of oak trees. And he was born in, actually not in Derry, but in Donegal, to the west of Derry. He was basically an aristocratic figure. He was the kind of the head of a family. he was basically a sort of an Irish prince in many ways. He became a priest and a bishop, as you can see here in this particular image. And for reasons that aren't really of any great importance to us, he went into exile to a place called Iona, to the island of Iona. You can just see it here on the map, an island in the southeastern part of Scotland. And he actually chose Iona because it was as far from, it was, he originally landed in Scotland south of Iona, but he could still see Ireland. On a clear day, it is still, of course, possible to see Ireland and Scotland because they're only separated by a small band of water. But he was so homesick for Ireland that he had to go to Iona because there he wouldn't see Ireland. And Iona became one of the great monasteries of the Middle Ages. Here are a few images of Iona, here is Iona today. It's still a place of pilgrimage. It's actually somewhat appropriately here in the old Presbyterian church. The monastery in Iona today is actually run by the Presbyterian church rather than the Catholic church, but it's a place of pilgrimage for Christians of all denominations, and indeed for people of no denomination at all. Here's another image of Iona. And again, this became one of those kind of monastic mother houses where people would be trained up, if you like, in the monastic way of life. The most famous product, I think, of Iona is the Book of Kells. And here is one of the most extraordinary documents of the entire Middle Ages. And the great achievement of Irish monks was what are known as illuminated manuscripts. And these illuminated manuscripts are copies of the Gospel. And these copies of the Gospel were obviously extremely elaborately decorated, but not just Gospels, kind of prayer books and manuscripts generally. And illuminated means simply that they are decorated to a very, very high degree. When Iona was under assault from the Vikings, from the north, from the Norsemen, many of its treasures were, brought back to Ireland and kept in a place called Kells, a monastery of Kells, and that's why we call it the Book of Kells. It is housed today in the library of Trinity College in Dublin. So here is the great library of Trinity College. I'm sure some of you have been to Trinity and may even have seen the Book of Kells in person, so to speak. Why is Iona important? It's important because it was the seed ground, if you like, for these monks to go out into southern Scotland and into northern England to bring the gospel. And perhaps the most notable of these monks of Iona is a man called Saint Aidan, who founded a monastery in an island called Lindisfarne. And if you can see this map here, you can see that part of northwest England, where Lindisfarne is situated. It's called the Holy Island, and in the Middle Ages it was called the holiest island in all of Britain. Here is a picture of Lindisfarne today, and here is yet another of these kind of wonderful monastic treasures, the Lindisfarne Gospel. Which is now to be seen in the British Museum, and here is yet another monk. This is Saint Cuthbert, who, as you can see, is a 7th century monk. He wasn't from Iona; he was from Lindisfarne. So you get the idea that monks started in Iona. Then they went to Lindisfarne, and Lindisfarne itself became a kind of seed ground for the re-evangelization of northern England. Here is the tomb of St. Cuthbert in the cathedral at Durham. Again, a great place to visit if you happen to be in England. One of the really, really great cathedrals of England. So Irish wandering monks went off to Scotland, and then they went to the northern part of England. I should say that England was kind of evangelized in two directions. First of all, from the north, and then, if you remember, or if you know, St. Augustine of Canterbury came to England in the 590s, and again, he was sent by the Pope. He was sent by Pope Gregory the Great, and he set up a great site in Canterbury, which of course is still the centre of Christianity in England today. The Archbishop of Canterbury is the direct descendant or direct lineal descendant of Saint Augustine of Canterbury. So you've got Irish monks in the northern part of England, and you've got people like Saint Augustine coming from Rome. The other part of the story is of these monks who came from kind of the south in a way. And the most important of them, I think, one of the most famous is St. Columbanus. And sometimes he is confused with Columkill, because Columkill from Iona is often called St. Columba. And then there's this man, St. Columbanus. They are two different people. So the next time you go to a cocktail party, don't shock people if you happen to say, did you know that Columba and Columbanus are different people? And they will be amazed at your knowledge. Both come from the word columba, of course, which means dove. It's the Latin word for dove. If you go to Italy today, you can see cakes shaped like doves, and they are known as columbae, and they're very popular at Easter time. St. Columbanus actually was a monk of a place called Bangor. And you can see here is a picture of the old, this is a modern 19th century church on the ancient site of the monastery of Bangor. Bangor is in the northern part of Ireland. It's just on the south side of Belfast Lough. Bangor was a very famous northern monastery, famous for a couple of things. It was famous for being austere, very harsh life, very difficult life in some ways, and it was also famous for its scholarship. So here's actually a little model. There's a museum up there nowadays, and here's a model of Bangor today. So basically, the monks lived in little huts. And they lived a kind of a hermit life, and then they had a common life together. So that was the most famous northern monastery. I see Steve looking slightly anxiously at the clock, so I will. I won't be too long. I know that you've got other meetings, so I'll just show you a few more images of these extraordinary monks making their trips to Europe. This is a mosaic from the harbour, where just on the coast of Saint Congal, who was the founder of this monastery, and here they are, sort of going off in the high seas to evangelize. And in fact, basically there were two motives for this. Some of them went off consciously to be evangelists, consciously to bring the gospel. And others went off simply to be alone, simply to be away, simply to have a kind of solitude. And then one of the kind of the great features of monastic life actually is that men went off to be alone, to experience a kind of a solitary life, but they were so impressive that they kind of built up a kind of a following. People said, well, I would like a bit of that for myself. So they tried to escape, and yet, they developed a kind of a group of spiritual brothers, and that's how a kind of a common monastery established. Anyway, this man, St. Columbanus, went to France. And he went, as I said a few minutes ago, to a place that was in a terrible, terrible state of disarray. It was, civilization had essentially collapsed in Western Europe, and the most famous account of this collapse of civilization in Western Europe is by a man called Deacon Gregory of Tours, who wrote a famous book called The History of the Franks. And what he describes is an extremely bloody, brutal, lawless kind of place. And that was the world that St. Columba or Columbanus from Bangor went. And he went to a number of places. He went, first of all, to France. He established a monastery at a place called Luxeuil. And in fact, here's an image of him in northern Italy, a mosaic of him, a kind of very ancient mosaic of him in the Cathedral of Brugnato in northern Italy. But before he got to northern Italy, he established a famous monastery in the eastern part of France, basically in the Jura Mountains, called Luxeuil. Again, famous for its scholarship. Here's a manuscript from that. And then he established a famous monastery in northern Italy called Bobbio, and that is in fact where he died. He died in 615, and here is the tomb of St. Columbanus in Bobbio. Columbanus was an extremely formidable person. He was tough-minded. He was, in some ways, sharp-tempered. You didn't want to get on the wrong side of St. Columbanus because he would let you know what he thought. He really was quite a tough-minded guy. He is famous for defending Christian orthodoxy. This was an era of heresy where there were lots of kind of false Christian teachings, and he defended Orthodox Christianity. He was famous for falling out with a local French king about the dating of Easter, which was a huge controversy in the Middle Ages. When should Easter fall? And there were different times for different churches. There was a Roman way of calculating the date of Easter. There was a Celtic way of calculating the date of Easter. And that was a subject of great contention. One of his followers was a man called St. Gall, and he is famous for establishing a monastery in St. Gallen in Switzerland. So here is actually the Cathedral of St. Gallen in Switzerland today. Another of these great Irish monks was a man called St. Cathal, which would be the Irish equivalent of Charles. And he established a monastery in the southern part of Italy, in Taranto, in a town, or the town is now known as San Cataldo. So if you've ever been to that part of Italy and you see people referring to San Cataldo, well, that is a reference to an Irish monk. Another of these great figures is Saint Killian, who is associated with the city of Würzburg in Germany. He came from a place in County Cavan in the Midlands of Ireland, and he brought with him a number of followers. And St. Killian is still the patron of Würzburg. Unfortunately, he met a bloody violent death. He was martyred by the local lord of Würzburg for reasons that are kind of a bit complicated, but basically this man was married to his deceased brother's wife, And St. Killian said, that's against the law. You're not allowed to be married to your deceased brother's wife. And this got back to the wife, who was very annoyed about it. And she ordered that he be beheaded. And he was martyred along with two companions, St. Columban and St. Tottenham. And if you go to Würzburg, you can see the statue of St. Columban. Here is the Cathedral of St. Killian in Würzburg. And indeed, there is a beer called Killian. There used to be a beer, Killian. And I mean, in October, Killian beer is still very popular in Germany. Here is the tomb of these martyred Irish saints in Würzburg. One final little kind of local sort of connection, I suppose, is Saint Virgilius. Saint Virgilius is the Irish saint or monk Fergal. Saint Fergal was, as you can see, an 8th century priest. He founded Salzburg, the great city where Mozart was born. He's also known as the Geometer because he was a kind of a scientist. He was a man of piety and Christian belief, but he was also a geometer. He was interested in proving that the world was round, the sphericity of the globe. Don't believe people who tell you that people in the Middle Ages thought that the world was flat. St. Fergal was an Irish monk who was able to show that the world was actually round. St. Virgil gives his name to a church here in New Jersey, Morris Plains. It's the same Irish priest, it's the same Irish monk, St. Virgil. I'll kind of finish with a little thought, or a couple of little thoughts. One of the great achievements of these wandering Irish monks was to bring the gospel, obviously, but also to bring a kind of strict way of life. I mean, as I said a few minutes ago, Western Europe in the early Middle Ages was a place of social and moral collapse. It was basically warlike. What these monasteries represented was a kind of oasis of civilization and Christian living and Christian life and Christian charity and Christian prayer in the midst of this collapsed civilization. And one of the great achievements, I think, of the Irish monks was to bring what are known as penitentials, and the penitentials were essentially forms of moral instruction for hearing confession. The practice of speaking your sins out loud, going to a priest, and being forgiven of your sins was basically brought to Western Europe by these Irish monks. And if you read some of the confession, some of the penitentials, you'll get some sense of just the strictness of these places, of these monasteries. So I'll finish by reading a couple of sentences from these penitentials. Basically, a penitential is to give the priest instruction as to what punishment there ought to be for your sins, your penance, as they say. So here are some of the punishments. For coughing, so just imagine the men together in a monastery. For coughing at the beginning of a psalm and for spoiling the singing, 6 slaps. So this was corporal punishment, 6 slaps. For celebrating mass with untrimmed nails, 6 slaps. For biting the chalice, 6 slaps. For smiling at the synaxes, that's a prayer, 6 slaps. So, I mean, if you have some thought that crosses your mind and you start smiling, and during the office of prayers you're slapped. For laughing out loud, a grave excuse, 12 slaps. So obviously the Summit Old Guard would not be well known for laughing out loud. would not go unpunishment. For receiving Holy Communion with unclean hands, 12 slaps. For forgetting the Blessed Sacrament when hurrying out to the field, 25 slaps. So this is kind of strict corporal punishment. For striking the altar, 50 slaps. So that's a fairly serious punishment. People think, well, that's a bit tough, but nonetheless, it kind of worked. Here's one my final little quotation from these penitentials, just to show, I think, that these monks really did have a kind of an insight into human nature. They were able to calibrate, if you like, degrees of moral failing, venial sins, mortal sins, and so on. If a monk loves any woman, but is unaware of any evil beyond a few conversations, he will do penance for 40 days. So, you just have if you talk to a woman, but you talk innocently, you have to do penance for 40 days. But if he kissed and embraced her, 1 year of penance. He who loves her in mind only, 7 days. But if he has spoken his love, but has not been accepted by her, 40 days. So things don't change that much over the course of the centuries. So these are extraordinary men, and they, if you like, kept the world intact. They kept civilization going when civilization was collapsing. So here we are in New Jersey, and just down the road in Morris Plains, there is the Church of St. Virgil, and there's a little memory, even here, of the extraordinary work of Irish monks in the Middle Ages. So I now know that I think I probably spoken enough, so thank you very much.
As soon as someone has a question online, raise your hand, and we have one. Rod Burns, you are on unmute, please.
All right. Professor, I was a 1962 graduate of Seton Hall, so welcome. Other than early European history, what subjects do you teach there today?
Oh, well, that's an easy question. I teach in the history department, obviously. I teach British history, and then I teach Irish history. And of course, those are two kind of very, very connected subjects for good or ill. So 1 year I'll teach Irish history, the next year I'll teach British history. And then I teach, Seton Hall has an honours program. In fact, there was an honours program way back in 1962, and I teach in the honours program. And that's a kind of a combination of history and philosophy. And I am also in charge of Seton Hall has a graduate program in history, and I'm in charge of that. It's a rather small program, and in fact, it's being sort of wound down. So that's what I teach: British history, Irish history, and then I teach in the honours program.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Okay.
Peter Merritt.
I read a book on the Dark Ages some years ago that said that St. Patrick was had Roman parents and therefore was probably well educated, and then was captured by the Vikings, enslaved by them when he was about 15, and then returned. Is that true as you know it, or any truth? Or
a good deal of truth. Patrick, his parents were Roman. That is to say, patricius means kind of patrician. Let me say our word, patrician. He certainly wasn't Irish. And there is a kind of a debate as to whether he was kind of based in Roman Britain or in France, but I think it was basically Roman British. He wasn't captured by the Vikings. He was captured by kind of marauding Irish tribes. The Vikings are a bit later, but he was certainly captured. And I don't know whether you were here when I kind of started, but I showed a little picture of a place called Slemish, and that's where he did his. That's where he spent his years of captivity. looking after pigs, actually. So the book that you read, I don't know what it was. You certainly remember most of it correctly. Yeah.
Nolan?
Hi, thanks for the great talk. Two questions.
Yeah.
You talked about a lot of people who lived in the 500s, a lot of people, but fewer in the 600s, much fewer people in the 700s, and almost nobody in the 800s. Did this great movement sort of fade out and die out over time, or you just didn't have time to carry into some historical figures later? Now, second question is a little off topic, but in 1095 AD, the Pope declared the First Crusade. It's my idle curiosity to know to what extent or did the Irish participate, as the English very much participated in the Crusades, and I realize that's several hundred years later. Thank you.
Those are two very good questions. The first question, to the second question, I will give an honest answer. I'm not absolutely sure. There certainly was a lot of English participation. The Irish participation, I will have to think about that, and I can get back to you. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure, but good question. The first question, did it kind of fade out? The answer to the question is really, it kept going for a long time. So the reason that I kind of looked at the 600s and then the 500s and 600s was basically just to be able to fit everything in. St. Fergal, for example, whom I ended with, was an 8th century, was in the 700s. There's certainly stories of the Irish going to Iceland and the Faroe Islands in the 8th century. If you've ever been to the southern part of southeastern Iceland, lots of place names have the word papa in it, which is basically the kind of Norse for priest, papar, paparvel, paparvik, and so on and so forth. Those would have been Irish 8th and 9th century pilgrims, and they were certainly going well into the 10th century, good question. But I think the kind of the high point of it all would have been the early 600s. The kind of the mid 600s and then the 700s.
Thank you.
Okay, we don't have any more questions online, so you want to go to the local questioners?
If I'm wrong, but I thought you said that I believe St. Bernardus was a best-selling author in those days.
Yeah.
How does one become a best-selling author before the printing press?
Well, it's easier because you don't produce as many books. No, that's a very good. That's a very, very good question. Sorry. The question was, how did St. Brendan become a best-selling author in the years before the printing press? Well, the answer is, first of all, I was speaking slightly flippantly when I said bestseller. That was just to kind of make the point that it was very popular. And excuse me. And it was very popular in a number of different versions. So there was a Latin version, there was a Danish version, there was a German version, there was a kind of French version. And essentially what happened is that these stories, and they were all slightly different actually. So these stories were transcribed in monasteries, and then they would be told in the oral tradition, and then other versions were transcribed. So one of the reasons that the stories were different is that, it's kind of Chinese whispers, as it were. I mean, you tell a story, and someone hears one thing, and someone hears another thing, and so on. But the story, I mean, they were transcribed, and then they were told told orally, so that's maybe bestseller is a slightly flippant way of putting it.
It's my great pleasure to present Dr. Quinn an appreciation of the Summit Old God Certificate of Appreciation. Dr. Dermot Quinn, we are happy to take this way of expressing our gratitude to you for the contribution you have made to our organization. Thank you very much.
Okay. Dr. Quinn, thank you so much for a presentation that was both erudite and entertaining. We appreciate it so much. We appreciate the fact that you have come back now for the third time. We are, sir, in your debt.